and companies waste hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars on campaigns without getting that core message right. And it's sort of just amplifying noise. The marketing collateral is an amplifier, and we really need to have that core piece in there, and it can be applied universally because of how universal story really is.
The news is broken officially that we've essentially rebranded the podcast. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate it. The cat's out of the bag.
Cat's out of the bag, new logo, and now Paul Kuthe's on with us. And just a little background, Paul is owner and managing director of Tributary Coaching. And I'll just be open from my side, really how we met, just to be open. I often get asked from, people that listen, why you do the podcast, Brad, and there's a lot of reasons why. But at the core of it, I learn a lot from my guests. And what's interesting is I had Caitlin Slocum on while back. She comes on. I was super impressed. She redesigns my website. Through her, I meet Paul. Paul works with me on the story and the branding of the entire website. And again, something that I've been planning for a while is the podcast. And it didn't take me very long to say, Paul, let's get going. Let's do some more work together.
That's perfect. It's a perfect intro and a perfect testament to the power of story, because how I got to meet Caitlin was through the experience of working with a shared client. And after working their website, she decided she needed to go on more podcasts to get word out about her business and about her web development firm. And so we did a great strategic session together where we really outlined her story and what she wanted to present as a message on those podcasts. And by gummit, if it didn't work, here you are.
So hold on. So let me understand this. So history, as we tie all this together, you were actually coaching or working with Caitlin then?
Originally, yes. So we had a shared client. She was developing the website. I was brought on to do the web messaging and brand development for that shared client. And in that process, seeing what we went and did together, she decided that's exactly what she needed before she went on a run of really putting herself out there, both in social, but also specifically around podcasts. And you can get yourself on a podcast, but what are you supposed to say that's actually going to inspire action?
That's incredible. And so just to break this down for those listening, essentially, and this is how my relationship was. So I think for those understanding, what was really unique. So when I did my website the first time, it was not this way. And the second time was a totally different experience. And essentially what happened is Caitlin, worked with me, and there's, questionnaire. And of course we really tried to understand a lot of direction of what I wanted. So she's building essentially the frame. And then she said, Brad, I bring Paul in because Paul's really going to help with the messaging and the content and the downloadable brochure that I love. That's on the website, of course, that you built. And so I worked with you, Paul, just as far as essentially the storytelling of it, right? Being the guide. And, a lot of people that are in marketing understand that methodology to some extent, but essentially you worked with me really on the core of the website. Then she branded it and put it together. And essentially that's the relationship between the two, at least that I had from the website.
Absolutely. Yep. Collaboration is so important. And often people will rush to build a website or make a video or get out another piece of marketing collateral, and companies waste hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars on campaigns without getting that core message right. And it's sort of just amplifying noise. The marketing collateral is an amplifier, and we really need to have that core piece in there, and it can be applied universally because of how universal story really is.
So when you think about core messaging, and you're really good at this, Paul, I will admit, like for those listening, especially as you're trying to think about the branding of the company, where did that start? I mean, a little bit of history of how you got into the role that you're in.
Sure. Well, it's a little bit of a unique background. I came to this whole work as from the perspective of a coach. And I approach all of the core messaging marketing work that I do from that perspective of a business coach. And what really brought me to business coaching was my work around brands and my previous professional athletic career. So I came to this business world as a pro athlete in the kayaking world. So producing and creating content for web, video, articles, everything I can do to put brands that I was sponsored by into the limelight in front of as many people as possible. I mean, they keep sending free kayaks if you can get them out in front of a lot of people. So that was how I got started, in the main goal. And what I saw is a lot of what I'll respectfully call kayak porn out there. It basically plotless, action-packed videos of kayakers doing amazing things, but with very little context, very little heart behind what's the story, what goes through their mind before these waterfalls. How are we approaching that? And the projects that I always loved being a part of were those that really dove into the human side and also the sort of the psychology and the story behind all of those things. So as I honed my skills at promoting brands and really refining my techniques as a business coach after my athletic career, bringing those worlds together is really where my passion and I think real power comes from. Because I basically teach people to wield the most powerful force known to mankind to affect human behavior. And that's story. And we talk about story a lot. And there's a lot of folks that say, yeah, tell a story. But how we're positioning ourselves in that story, how we put the brand in that story in relation to the client or the audience is everything. And taking some of these ancient concepts and frameworks and applying them to what we do today has immense power for good and evil. It's a tool. So spreading the message here and having your listeners hear it, hopefully there's many people doing good out there in the world with this stuff as possible. But that's what we're going to teach you today, how to wield that power.
How difficult is it when you think about, wielding that power for you as you're working as a coach and you're coaching myself or any client that you have, to understand, essentially trying to diagnose and understand kind of their product, their specialty, their industry, and then how they're broadcasting that. How difficult is that depending on the industry, depending on the client? Are there similarities? Are there common things that, themes that you can pull between kayaking or construction, for example?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, and the river is beautiful because it offers endless analogies for life and for business. But no, I think that there is a real commonality and fundamental nature of this, because before we had written communication, I mean, people learned everything that we knew through passing stories, and the psychology around that is profound. And so if we can really harness those things and skillfully use that tool, we're really honing something that gets in underneath all the noise. And something I think we all agree is there's a ton of noise out there. People are not going to burn a ton of calories to understand your message. You maybe have them for a moment. What can you say that's going to connect directly to something that's going to help them survive and thrive? A lot of the work that I have studied and have become a story brand certified guide is under the work of Dr. J.J. Peterson and Donald Miller. And they talk about how really, we're all just trying to survive and thrive. And so as soon as we start relaying a message, whether that's a piece of marketing collateral, a corporate speech, an email to your team, a podcast intro, it's all about what about this is going to help me solve a problem that's going to directly link to surviving or thriving as a human being. And can I get that across with so much clarity? You have to burn almost 0 calories to understand it, meaning you have to think very little. It just hits it instantly.
And how does that change, when you look at a company, if they really understand the survive and thrive, and we understand that the end customer, the end clientele for all of us, of course, attention span is a lot less for everybody. We're all busier than ever with so many distractions and iPhones and social media and everything else. You're trying to capture that quickly. What's the separator for companies to do a really good job to capture that attention, to deliver that story quickly, as you give the analogy of burning like 0 calories?
Absolutely. So really what I spoke about in terms of positioning. So if you frame this story around your role in the story being the hero, then what you're going to end up doing is displacing your client. So here's what I mean. When we wake up at the beginning of the day, we are at the center of our own story. We are the hero of that story, right? And you can hear the soundtrack playing. Hopefully it's a good one. And you kind of wake up and you move through your day as the center of the scene in this movie, right? So if you're the hero of the story already and you meet another hero, what happens when 2 heroes meet in a story? Right? They're going to collide. They're going to conflict. They're that, or they're going to go their total own separate route. But if you want to be a part of your client's story, if you want to be doing business with them, you're going to find another way to position yourself in that story. You have 4 choices when it comes to main characters: hero, victim, villain, and guide. You can be the hero, you can be the victim, you can be the villain, and the guide. And the truth is, we're all a bit of all of them. But where do you emerge? How do you really show up most prominently? And if you show up as the hero in this story with your client, you're going to displace them into one of the other three characters. They're not the guide, right? You're supposed to be helping them. So that leaves what, victim or villain? I don't think you want to make one of those your client either. So you really need to figure out, how do you show up in that guide position? Storytellers, I mean, goes back to the time of Aristotle and before. They've always had this other character that they introduce into the story that helps the hero win the day. They're that sage advisor. They're that Obi-Wan, if you will, or that so they're that one that is along for the ride, but really helps the journey win the day. And if you show up as the hero, you're really trying to show up as really the second weakest character in the whole story. And so by positioning yourself as that guide, that's what's going to grab their attention, because we are naturally looking for a guide when we're moving through the story as the hero character in our day. We admire heroes, we honor them, but when we're looking for a leader, we often will gravitate towards that guide figure.
It's interesting, because as you break this down, you think about this. I mean, I don't want to say it's common sense, because it's not. I mean, a lot of us, I would say, having no understanding, let's say, of building a storyline, of branding as a company, not having the acumen that you have, Paul, you would think, yeah, as a business, I need to be the hero, right?
I save the day.
Save the day. Like, this is why you're hiring us. This is what we do. Like, of course, we're not going to be the villain, right? We're trying to avoid to be the villain by the end of the construction project. That's the idea. Or the victim, you definitely don't want to be the victim. As you're working with brands, do you have to, how difficult is it for you as you're working with your clients to say, you're the guide, you're not the hero, and then essentially identifying that story and maybe that branding strategy with them?
It can be a real challenge. There can be some really ingrained mindset around this stuff. So, for example, in a construction company, a company might come on to say on a video or on their website, you should hire us because we're the best. We've been around since 1975 or whatever, and we've built more houses than anybody in the area. But they only care about their house. They care about the one that's going to help them win the day, and for whatever reason that is. And so when we start talking about how to show up for the client, if we're talking features and benefits and past accolades, and we won best places to work and all that sort of stuff, that's not really connecting to what the audience needs for surviving and thriving. And so what we can do instead is really speak to that customer's problem, and really knowing what that is on an intimate level. Not just that they need a house or they need a new space. We know that as sort of an exterior level of problem. We need to get into the interior and sort of philosophical levels of problem as well. That's sort of the emotional layer, is that interior problem. How's that hero feeling about having that problem of needing that new house? And then philosophical, what is just plain wrong? It's the good and versus evil in the universe, right? What is just plain wrong about them having to experience this problem? And if you can show up in their story and help them and help figure out how to solve all three of those layers of problem by doing business with you, you not only have a new customer, you have a new, what they call raving fan. You have a new sort of best friend out there in the world telling everybody what a great job that you did.
It's incredible. And so as you're thinking, as you're working with brands, and maybe for anyone listening, as they're identifying maybe their own position as a guide in their company or industry, how important is it for you to identify maybe pain points of the customer? How does that play a role to understand, okay, let's lay out and itemize the issues the industry has, or a potential client would have, and that's going to help us more answer the story, and how we're going to essentially broadcast the guide portion?
That's a great question. And we'll use this example for the podcast here, right? We needed to go in and figure out, well, the listeners of the AFT Construction Podcast, what problems are they experiencing? What are the other sort of folks that are showing up in this audience that are looking for guidance and looking for a path forward? And by really understanding who it was in that audience and what it is that they were showing up with, the problems that you're able to solve, we are able to really hone in on that message for that person. And so I think one of the first things we did, Brad, right? I pulled you in and we had a little meeting where I peppered you with questions that some of them I already knew the answer to. I wanted to hear it from your voice. Some of it is questions that maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect for a podcast rebrand. Some of it was really looking at strategically what problem does this podcast solve for you as a podcast host and producer, and then what is this going to solve for the client. That shared benefit is where the magic really is. And so it really takes the time and the effort and that you put forth and that we did together to really answer those tough questions and really look at the reviews of the past podcast. What do people love about it? What do people keep showing up wanting more of? And really listening to that audience and listening to what it is that they want. And if that's even broader experience and even more of the nuts and bolts behind business generally, as it pertains to both construction and the broader world, then so be it.
Yeah, and I love that breakdown and application, especially for us. I mean, essentially with this podcast, and speaking with Paul, just to be open to the audience here, for the 4 years the podcast has grown, and we've been really fortunate. Part of the reason I started the podcast, again, had met some interesting people, some interesting clients. A lot of my clients have been guests, which is kind of funny. But even though I own a construction company, I've been always open on the podcast that we're business owners that happen to focus on our specialty. Mine's construction. But at the core, a lot of my guests, such as yourself, Paul, you're not a contractor, but you bring so much information to the listener who's an entrepreneur. And every listener of the podcast is an entrepreneur. Yeah, maybe a lot of them are in construction or architecture design, but at the core, all my guests that I bring on are specialists, professional athletes or marketing or website design, or, some related to construction and building science and all the different applications. And I felt that, when I reached out to Paul, just being open, I'm like, hey, the AFT Construction Podcast, there's some brand identity there with our construction company here in Scottsdale. But again, I didn't want to limit it to just construction as part of it. I didn't want to limit it to just the company. I didn't want to limit it to just maybe Phoenix or Scottsdale where we're based. I felt that there had to be a brand that was a little bit farther reaching, especially for the entrepreneurship listeners. And that's why bring Paul on. And I'm like, this is perfect for the launch, because let's speak about, just how you diagnose that and kind of your journey working with me through that.
Absolutely. And I love that you are transparent and willing and vulnerable enough to bring your audience along on that journey with you. And I think that speaks to sort of the kind of leader that you are. And sort of, we talked about that philosophical level of problem. And I think it would just be plain wrong or just a shame to have the kind of knowledge guests that you bring on, the insights that you bring to just that realm and just in that construction space, because what you're doing and what you bring to it is going to be universally applicable across industries, so that everybody can be doing business in a way that's more productive, more profitable for them, and just better for the greater community as a whole. So well done on bringing folks along on this journey, and appreciate being a little part of it.
Yeah, I'm super grateful to have you on it. You and so many others, Paul, that have been so many great guests. And I think at times we all question our vulnerability. I did a 4-year anniversary podcast a few weeks ago, and was pretty vulnerable in that one, shared some really personal things. But at the end of the day, I think, and I know you're the same, because Paul and I spoke about this offline. I mean, there's value to being authentic, right, wrong, and different, mistakes I've made, who I am as a person, shortcomings I've had and still have. I'm learning, just like all of us are, like every day, every guest that I bring on the show, they have content and inspiration and stories and examples that, for me, I listen, I'm like, wow, that's a great idea. Time for me to make that change, and it's just, it's instrumental, because I've realized, today I had lunch with 2 of my employees, essentially 2 of my senior directors,
Mm-hmm.
and I just commended them, because I've seen them recently, like Adam, who's over the field. His knowledge is way more vast than I have with construction. And then Spencer, who's, running a lot of our systems and operations. I sit there and I'm just like, he has an understanding of document control and Bluebeam and all these different systems that's way beyond where I'm at. And, we would never be successful as a company without them. And I just sit there and I'm like, I'm grateful to be associated with them. And I think that's really important, is that none of us should ever be fearful of hiring people that are better than us or more experienced or more intelligent than us. Yeah, you have to. I mean, how's that been for you, Paul? Just understanding that I'm sure all of us have to go through that at some point of our growth.
Absolutely. it's part of being on that journey. And some of the things that you speak to there, the vulnerability and the challenges that come with it, and your willingness to take the advice from a guest on a podcast and implement it. It speaks to one of the key elements that really people need to show up with. They're going to show up as the guide. And that's empathy and competency. You have to have both, right? So empathy and competency. So you've walked that path, you know the struggles, you've actually been there, you share them on the podcast, but also you do implement them and you do get good results, and you have had that level of competency that when you have them hand in hand, that's what makes a really good guide. And if you overdo it on trying to highlight all the competency, you become the hero of the story. But you need both. You need to check that box in the back of their brain. And so really taking that role as guide seriously, and really being willing to have the humility, frankly, to go and hire somebody that knows more about the subject than you do, whatever it is that you're needing to find to fill in that gap. That's one of the first sort of bottlenecks or stepping stones that a lot of entrepreneurs and business owners stumble on. Is they hire mini-me's, they hire people that are just like them, but maybe just not quite as sharp. And then what you get is a bunch of gaps in the business still, and a really limiting factor there, and that you're not going to be able to grow or expand beyond your own capabilities because you haven't hired somebody that operates outside of those. As soon as you hire somebody outside of your own capabilities, you're hiring to expand the capabilities of the business beyond what you could do on your own.
Here's a question for you, Paul. As you're breaking this down and explaining this about, I think what's really difficult for anyone listening, including myself, when you're a leader, you have this image, or I don't want to say understanding, but maybe this conception that you have to be super sturdy, can't be vulnerable, have to know all the answers, right? And use the word empathy. And we'll come back to the competency part, because essentially that's it. Like, you have to have all the answers, be competent, right?
Yeah.
How empathy, I think, is really difficult, I think, for any of us as humans. I know for me, I think it's difficult to be empathetic all the time. Part of that's genetics, part of that's upbringing. I mean, there's a lot of different things that factor into that. How can a leader learn to be more empathetic and have empathy for their personnel that work for them, for their employees, for their clients, for their vendors? I mean, the list goes on, but it's really tough to maybe put off the ego and then be empathetic.
It is a challenge. And I appreciate the element of that challenge that you highlighted, in that it can be sometimes outside the norm of what somebody might envision as a good leader, because empathy implies maybe some weakness, or some, having struggled as well. And of course, it's what people need to see in a leader, is their ability to have struggled and to overcome that. But I think, to put it in practical terms, something that somebody can do on a day-to-day basis as a leader, maybe before you're having that conversation with a coworker, or maybe before you send that email or try to think through what just happened in a meeting, is to really put it on almost like a storyboard, almost like your previous guests who produced videos, Lynn and Ian, talk about really having that storyboard thought out, and think about, all right, in this story, what's their 3 layers of problem? Like, if they're the hero of the story, if you have maybe a challenging employee that you need to have a coaching moment with and provide some tough feedback, what is their story? If as they are walking through their day, if they're the hero and they encountered this 3 levels of problem, what are they? And if you don't know what they are, what questions can you ask to really understand the problem before you, as a guide, create a plan and call them to action? I think a lot of leaders skip that part. They go to, well, I know what needs to happen different. You need to take this action. And they try to provide maybe an idea of the stakes. Here's the positives. It'll happen if you do it. Here's the negatives if you don't. They often will skip over or assume that first part of the brand script that we put any brand through, which is, who's the hero of this story? What 3 levels of problem are they experiencing? And how can we better position ourselves as a guide like leader, or a coach like leader, in this context? And if there's missing information, if something's not making sense, we know that we're missing some information. What questions can we ask at the beginning of that interaction that'll fill in those gaps, so that we can provide the right plan and provide the right coaching next steps. Even if you're going to provide the same steps, just having listened and really shown to have understand their problem on all three of those levels will create so much more openness, and they'll be so much more receptive to whatever feedback or advice you'd give them.
So as you kind of pivot now from the empathy aspect that you just answered,
Yeah.
the competency, how does that play a role? Especially, we were just speaking about part of being any successful CEO, right? You're going to hire people that, there's two parts to hiring, right? There's one where, hey, I want to be surrounded by great people. I'm going to hire great people. They're
Yep.
going to excel. They're going to build a brand, build a company. That's great. There's another aspect where you're like, hey, if someone can perform, and you hear different percentages, but someone that's 60 to 70% competency of, like, if they can perform to 60 to 70% of what you do, Paul, or what I do,
Yeah.
hire them, outsource that, which allows me to focus on other aspects of the company. So you have kind of those two angles.
Yeah.
How does that play with competency when you give that example along with empathy?
Well, that's a good question, and I appreciate it. I think that something that jumped out at me that you had in there was the idea of somebody being able to do 60, 70% of what you could do, and to move on and outsource that. And I know that one of the hardest pieces of that is accepting that it's not going to be as good as you could do it on your own, especially early on when you're starting to hire folks. You have to remember that you are probably delivering at 200% of expectation to start with. And so if somebody can do it 70 or 80% as good as you, they're probably meeting or exceeding the expectation of the client, and have a little bit of trust and faith that they will figure out how to get to 100%. They'll figure out how to do that as long as they actually have some of the key characteristics. And this is where the guiding principles come in as a leader. Are you hiring to the key characteristics that you can't really train? And by key characteristics, I mean, to be a functioning part of our team, we know that you need to be an independent problem solver, a good communicator, and be customer focused. If you do those three things, you can't really get it wrong, because we're going to be able to make minor corrections, and those, if we can get clear that those are the three guiding sort of principles, we can get that 60% up to the 100% in time, and we can train those things, or we can outsource folks to help make it even better. But if I think what would be the best thing to have in place would be a clear set of guiding principles. Sometimes companies will call these values. Sometimes you'll hear different things, but they're often sort of nebulous, inactionable sort of things. Like, I don't know, like trustworthiness. Like, yeah, all right. I mean, but what if it was tell the truth? What if that was sort of everyone on our team always tells the truth? They just do. Sometimes it's hurts. Sometimes it's not what we want to hear, but we always tell the truth. What are the guiding principles that you can keep bringing in front of the team, and bringing and hiring to, and bringing as a focus of the kudos or accolades you give, to keep bringing people back to those guiding principles? I think that's what lets the team make decisions as though you were in the room as the owner, even though you're not able to be there as the things grow and things scale, and you're not able to be in every decision.
What are things that brands do wrong? Maybe just as, in their messaging, or, in your experience, especially as you're coming in now to work through that revamp and that remessaging.
Yeah. It really goes back to either not positioning themselves correctly in the story, or not being clear. Confusion is what kills most messaging. People are going to do and what they understand the quickest. And that they don't follow the best leaders. They don't buy the best products. They buy the ones that they understand will solve their problem the quickest. And if you can become really clear with your messaging, then you're going to be ahead of the game. Now that means keeping in mind, this is something we train a lot of marketers on. Every time you offer a piece of information about your brand, it's like asking somebody to hold on to 10-pound bowling ball. You hand it to them. There they go. They're holding on to it. And they look pretty happy. Like they got it. And they can hold on to that pretty securely for quite a while. And then you want to say something else about your brand. You want to tell them this other thing it does, or this other great thing about it. You just handed them a second bowling ball. Now they're looking a little stressed. Like they might tuck one under each arm. They're like, cool, okay, I got it for a while. Now you hand that third bowling ball to them. But this time you mess up. You use like an inside industry term or something that like you have the curse of knowledge. You use this term so much, you understand this concept so deeply that it just falls out of your head without you even thinking. Now you've handed them this third bowling ball with a thick coating of Vaseline on it, and they are all over the show with this thing. As soon as you hand it to them, how many of those bowling balls do you think they drop?
Yeah.
All of them. All of them. They're not remembering anything you just said. So a lot of brands, they will be unclear, but they'll also try to say too much. And that's where really boiling down that messaging and getting down to the core essence. One clear concept, something you can look for that's practical. If you've written a post or you've written a piece of messaging or an email to a client or whatever, and it's full of ands and commas, you need to start over. The ands and commas are sort of, I loved Donald Miller's take on this. He says, ands and commas are like curse words. You want to use them as infrequently as possible and only when absolutely necessary. And so as every comma is another bowling ball. It's one more thing you have to remember. It's one more. So just a piece of writing advice or messaging advice that's just practical right there. Try to write it, avoiding the ands and commas, make it clear, and always come back to that one central controlling idea. What's that big bowling ball you want them to walk home with and actually have at the end of the day?
And I'll come back to the confusion and clearness, but I think something I picked up on that you mentioned, you said, quickly, you said curse of knowledge. And I'm like, oh, that's
Curse of
interesting. That's
knowledge.
the curse of knowledge that, yeah, especially as that relates to me in contracting, on the day to day, we understand the business, but there's a lot of technical things that have to do with the home that essentially that can hurt us if we're too technical or if we're saying things that are confusing the customer and they don't really understand the differentiation of price or cost on certain things. And so,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, things that maybe it doesn't even impact the confusion, but it could be the clarity, and that curse of knowledge could be distracting to the end user or end client.
Well, here's the scary part, Brad, is that most people don't know they have it. Like you have a level of 8, 9, or 10 of whatever industry you're in, right? You're the entrepreneur. You know this stuff inside and out. It goes deep for you. And you know that the client's not there. And so you bring it down. So instead of an 8, 9, or 10, you're at like a 6. And that's great. And that's helpful. But what we don't realize is often the client's at like a 2 or 3, but they're not going to share that with you. But that distance between 2 or 3 and 6, that gap is the curse of knowledge. And it's this space where you may say something that the client then immediately assumes, well, he said it like I'm supposed to know.
Yeah.
I'm sure not going to ask what that means. I'm going to just keep smiling and nodding. And that way they won't know that I actually don't know enough to make this decision. And what it does is it immediately pushes that client out of position. They're no longer the hero. They're no longer empowered. They now are feeling a little bit less confident, a little bit weaker in the story. And so we really want to make sure and just scour this. We talk about the grunt test jokingly sometimes. And it's the idea that, say you put your website in the lap of a caveman for 8 seconds and you close the laptop. Can that caveman sort of grunt out, what are you offering? How does it make my life better? And how do I buy? And the reason we talk about this is not because your ideal client's a caveman. It's because that's the level of time and mental commitment they're going to give to your brand in order for that message to get across. And so that level of clarity and being able to sort of get at those key things is what we really want to focus on.
Yeah, it's fascinating because as you think about that, the reality is if we have to make things really complex for the client, if they're confused, if they're, there could be a level of, we never want to put ourselves on a different level, right? Whether
Right.
it's intelligence or communication wise, but also just at the core of it, as you mentioned, it's just like, if they come in and they can't understand what we're selling and what we're doing,
Right.
they're never going to make that call or initiate that transaction to go into business.
People don't move into a fog. I'll often, when I'm training clients on this, I'll bring up the old days when I was teaching people to run waterfalls. And as a young guide coming out to run rivers with folks, I would want to reassure them that I knew what I was talking about, because I was too young to possibly get them safely down this river. And so I would cruise up next to them and I would say, oh, we're gonna run this waterfall down there. It's gonna be super fun. And I would go about, like, naming every little detail. Like, we're going to go just to the left of that rock, and there's that little micro current that's going to take us to the right. And then when you get over to that eddy, we're going to be right at the top of the waterfall. You want to go off the right side of the waterfall with left angle on your boat. And when you land, paddle down, and I'll meet you on the left-hand side. It's going to be super fun. Trust me. And I'd paddle off, and look back and they'd be gone. They're still like clinging to the rock. No chance they're going to move forward, right? It's just, it's too complex. It was too confusing. There's too many details. Like, that you said at least 3 terms in there that I'm not sure what that really means. They're not going to move forward. It's scary, right? Like, whether you're selling a product or selling a team member on an idea, or selling your spouse on what movie to go see tonight, or which restaurant to go to, or selling your kid on doing their chores, we have to really make it clear and simple, and have that plan. So I learned a little bit, like, later on in life, when I was a little bit more of a sort of seasoned veteran guide, I'd cruise up above that same waterfall, and I'd say, "Hey, Brad, we're going to run this waterfall. It's going to be super great. We're going to go left at the top. We're going to go off the right side. I'll meet you in the eddy on the left. Ready? Here we go." And I'd head off, and you know what? They'd be right behind me. Brad, you'd be right behind me. Your eyes would still be huge, but you'd be right behind me paddling off that waterfall, because it was clear. There was 3 easy steps that created a plan, and there was no ambiguity about what I needed to do to move forward.
So do you feel like you have a cheat sheet, being that you were a guide on the kayak and now you're taking that same analogy and understanding, being the guide to us business owners?
A cheat sheet, a little bit. I mean, I got trained by the harshest instructor out there, Mother Nature, and when you get it wrong out there, you feel the consequences. The feedback loop is apparent, and vicious sometimes. So there is a little bit of that, but I think there's just a passion for me to be in that space of decision, and to be able to help people with that story that empowers action. And it's the same thing, whether it's marketing or leadership or guiding people down the river. It's, how do we frame the story so that they are able to take action? At the end of the day, that's the only thing that actually matters. And that's the only thing that moves our businesses forward is action. And so if we can, whether it's telling ourselves the right story around the next piece of action you need to take in your business, or telling your customer the right story, these things are powerful. So we need to be authentic and real with them. Otherwise, we're just manipulating people. But I think that's what really excites me about all of these things, and the common thread that brings it all together.
Now, when you think about the clientele you've had over the years, hopefully I wasn't difficult. You never know. But, as you're working with different clients, how do you maneuver that difficulty of trying to get on the same page, to understand pain points, to understand the messaging, to understand their education of the guide? Did you ever have this tug and pull of what, as they're working through a rebrand or remessage, is there ever opposition or headbutting on essentially the messaging?
Oh, completely. Yeah, no. And just to make it official, no, Brad, you're not a difficult client. I probably wouldn't have any moment there where I felt too challenged. But I think that the real thing that you run into doing this work is in that well-worn path that people and companies have, that tendency to want to show up and be the center of the story. And there's a lot of different ideas and thoughts about marketing and messaging out there. And so my biggest challenge is usually when there's a creative dispute with an internal team that ends up being so close to it. They have that embedded curse of knowledge. They have that embedded path of showing up and trying to sort of big themselves up and show up as the best possible company, that it can be hard to see the forest for the trees, so to speak. You can get too close to it. And that's where really having somebody from the outside that has that different perspective will allow that shift, and that potentially huge paradigm shift of how they should be showing up in the story. When you're sort of see the story from that one perspective, it's really tough to make those changes. And there's a lot of habits ingrained in there. So I'd say that'd be the biggest challenge, is really helping them see past that curse of knowledge, see the story from a little bit different perspective, and be willing to make some of those changes that, let's face it, it's risky. It's investment. It's money. It's resources that could go to something else. And when you've been doing something the same way for a long time as an internal team, it can be scary to shift it.
As you look at this, with the story messaging, A lot of this is focused on a couple things. We mentioned the website, right? As you're
Yeah.
rebranding the website and you want to catch people's attention right away. Pretty straightforward. Podcast, similar. Like you worked with me on the imaging, the colors, the
Yep.
messaging, everything as far as what the podcast is now, the Brad Leavitt Podcast, as opposed to AFT Construction. What are other channels? How for a lot of us that are using social media
Yeah.
and other ways to advertise to our clients, how can we utilize that same story and messaging in other platforms as opposed to maybe
Mhm.
something that's a little bit, I don't want to say low hanging fruit, but a lot of us understand the website and where you
Mhm.
have something that's maybe less attention span.
Yep. That's the beauty of having this framework that we call creating a brand script. And so once you have that framework and you have that underlying structure, sort of skeleton of the story, we talk about it. So it's like chords on a guitar. Once you learn a range of these chords, you can start to arrange them in different ways to create some pretty beautiful music and music that draws masses. And what that means is really being able to break down this brand script, which every story has 7 key parts. There's these 7 key parts of the story that exist in almost every story, especially any good story that people will revere and tell over and over. There's that character. That character is the hero, and they always run into a problem. That problem exists and they can't solve it themselves. The storyteller introduces that guide characters. There's a guide section of the story. That guide is going to offer a plan, hopefully in 3 clear steps. So you can go off that waterfall, take that action. And that guide's job is to call their hero to action. So the call to action is a key piece of this, whether it's a website or a social media post or an email, a sales email to a client. Maybe it's the end of a proposal. So many folks forget to actually call them to action. What do you want them to do? Like, tell them exactly what you want them to do. You have also this job of a guide is framing the stakes. What does life look like on the other side of this positive step? And what are you risking if you don't take it? Those 2 key ends of the story. All of it is really always about how the character transforms. How does that hero change? That's one of the beautiful things about business is that it's really just a vehicle for change, right? Running a river, running a business, both of them will transform who you are, and you get to decide how that works. But those 7 key parts, if you can get that down for your business, if you can understand your client hero, you get their problem, you really offer them a guide that has a plan and can call them to action and frame those stakes, you're going to have something that you can use formulaically without feeling like a formula to get to the core heart of the story. In fact, we argue if you haven't been speaking from one of those 7 pieces of the story in your social media post or in your podcast episode, then no one's listening. You
That's
have to be
fascinating.
squarely in one of those 7 spaces. So
So
that
with
might be
the,
like a social media post, right? Like you could do an empathy social media post that's drawing from, here's the guide section, and we're going to draw on empathy. And you could talk about how you had this exact problem of a client, in my first house, I had this issue, or in my first business, I ran into this thing, and tell the funny story about how you screwed up, because that makes you empathetic and positions you as a good guide. And then you could pop in a call to action at the end. So you're grabbing 2 pieces of your brand script of those 7, using them in a social media post, done in 5 minutes, off it goes.
Oh, that's such a good breakdown. The reason is, Paul, is I was thinking through this as you mentioned the brand script.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense on a website. It's a little bit longer form. There's a lot of different ways to create the messaging, and
Right.
as you mentioned, downloadable brochure. This is really going to help paint the picture of being the
Mm-hmm.
guide and information to get through this journey and this
Yeah. Yeah.
this journey you have, right? This trial, if you will. But I think it's fascinating as you break that down for social media because as you think about like a call to action, and
Right.
earlier on you mentioned, hey, you don't want to position yourself as the hero, like, hey, call me, I'm this expert or whatever, right?
Right.
And you don't want it to where you're confusing, but there are calls to action and there's pain
Mm-hmm.
points that are part of this brand script and there's problems that come up for the customer. And essentially, we can find ways to answer that with the messaging and the content and
100%.
the videos or photos. And then that's a way that we're essentially building that audience so that people are listening.
Absolutely. Yeah. It works for a social media post. It works for a corporate speech. If you're building an email as a memo, you can break it down in this exact same formula that it grabs people's attention. We spend 30% of our day daydreaming, just on average. And you throw people in a dark room and throw a movie on, and you've got them locked in for a couple hours because it's wielding that power of story. And so that's what we need to do, is wield that same formula in this way for all the communication that we're really using, whether it's in a sales context, sales, leadership, marketing. It all is going to apply and have that universal truth underneath it. So looking at the podcast rebrand was no exception to that. And moving forward, as you look at the next episode description you write, or the next post you put out about, it could be 5, 6, 7 guests from now, tying that back to the original messaging and the original brand script becomes so much easier to create that copy. And if you need to hand that to a contractor, or you need to take it to a web developer or a videographer or somebody else to make marketing collateral, you can hand them that brand script as well. And then that's going to assure that you have continuity in your messaging. It's going to sound like you, it's going to look like you, it's going to be you, because they have the core sort of blueprint of what your messaging needs to be.
So what keeps you up at night? What stresses you out, Paul?
So my stresses come, of course, from really imagining, solutions for clients. I do my best to not ride the roller coaster. And what I mean by that is, as a coach, it's really important to be able to appreciate client successes, but always knowing that those are their successes. And if I'm going to ride those highs, then I'll end up riding the same lows when they have challenges and when they have failures. And when we are pushing the limits of what we're capable of and we're trying new things that nobody's done before, we're going to have failures. And so my challenge is continuing to not ride that roller coaster with the client, but still be at their side, kind of be that moderating force in their world, and clear-eyed perspective to be able to answer and ask those questions and get to the root of what's really going on. And it's impossible for me to do that if I'm riding that roller coaster. And so for me, it is separating those wins and losses and realizing that those are theirs and their outcomes based on their actions. And I can only do so much to help. So I end up I have a lot of that empathy and a lot of care and passion for my clients. And often that's what keeps me up at night, is the same thing keeping them up at night.
Yeah, I'm sure, especially as you get into the brand script and working with clients, there's an emotional connection, a human connection there, that you're really feeling their business. How can you rebrand it? And I'd imagine that, I don't want to say it puts pressure on, but like anybody, you want to perform. Like you're a professional athlete, you want to perform when, you're called up, and now you're being hired to essentially help someone broadcast their message.
That's what I love about the sport of kayaking, and I love about business is you either get the results or you don't, and the outcomes are really clear and immediate. Often, if you're measuring the right things, and that is it's intimidating at times, but we're right there with our clients. We understand how it goes, and continue to progress and push ourselves and to learn new things and to do better as well. So being right in that same space of continual improvement is what keeps me going. And I don't know that I would be interested without that emotional investment. I don't know that it would be as fulfilling without that. And so I remind myself of that as I'm feeling stressed out or staying up late at night. Is that's part of what makes it worth doing. That's just you're feeling the purpose. And if you weren't feeling that, then you're not really working in your purpose.
Well, what's the risk if you don't have that adrenaline, right? That essentially, like you mentioned, that risk. I would imagine part of that not only gives you passion and satisfaction and your daily role, right? Like work consumes most of our lives for all of us. And so if you're not passionate about it, it's really hard to be motivated. And then another aspect of that, I would imagine that it also keeps you on your toes, right? To continue to educate yourself, to continue to push yourself, and which is going to make you a better coach in the long run anyways.
Oh, absolutely. But I love to talk about work-life balance being a cruel myth, especially for the entrepreneur and the business owner. Because they're not separate. It's not work like back in the old days. You'd pull the whistle at the factory and you'd go home, and that'd be that. There'd be a complete separation of work and life. And then we talk about this balance. Balance is so tenuous. And as we know, as things grow and change, they're anything but balanced. I don't know if you've seen a teenager try to run.
I have three of them.
Oh my gosh, right? Nothing's in balance, right? But it's necessary for growth to be out of balance sometimes. But if the goal is work-life balance, sometimes it can feel like a failure when things aren't in balance, when really it means we're growing and changing. And so I like to talk a lot more about work-life integration. What can we do to make successful work-life integration in this world? Because the reality is they're not separate. We have calls at all hours. There's demands of us all the time. And there's moments where we do get to integrate our life and have our kid come to work, or be able to take an afternoon off to go to see them graduate or whatever it is. And to be able to really spend that time and make those decisions. It's about having the successful integration as the goal, as opposed to this ominous, never quite there in balance sort of state. And so I like to beat back against that myth a little bit, and sort of just offer an alternative, slight mind shift around that, to have us all aspiring to a better work-life integration.
Well, I'm going to say that I have to steal that work-life integration from you, Paul. I think that's
Oh, do it.
fantastic. And the reason I say that is because I was thinking about just our experience working together on the rebrand.
Sure.
And for those listening, there was, you were camping or something, because you sent me a message. It was late in the day. It was pretty late. And then there was like a picture of a campfire, and you're like, hey, I'm going to be spending some time with the family, and we're out
Yeah.
here. You got the campfire going. And so essentially you're working, you're still messaging me, but at the same time saying, hey, Brad, get a hint. Like, I'm going to have some personal time now. So
It's about being able to outline those clear sort of boundaries, and a lot of that gets thrown around a lot, but it's just communicating, just being honest and clear about it. Like, I am there for my clients and quite present at all times, but when I'm not, I'm not. And as long as you communicate those things and you set people's expectations and then you exceed them, you're not going to go wrong. And so I think that a lot of the time, this comes home to roost with the family and the kids and wife as well, and having shared integrated work-life goals. Are they in this mission with you? Are they down with that plan? Do they understand when you need to take that call, because they know ultimately you're working towards the same story, you're working towards the same goals, and have that space and trust to know that when it is time, you're going to be able to tell that client, I'll check back with you in 12 hours. I'm going to be out, and have a reason for that. So communication, setting expectations, being really clear with it, and having that successful integration really kind of stems from that on both sides of the equation, for the clients as well as kids, home life. Ultimately, being present for them is what truly matters. And you can't be present for them and take them on amazing adventures unless you're also there for clients. And so it's a balance there that is best done through integration.
So best advice you've been given?
Best advice I've been given. Oh, nice. Okay. I'm gonna try to tie this back a little bit. One is to be the guide, but I think we beat that into submission throughout the whole podcast. So alternatively to that, it's going to be to ask the right questions. For me, I think a lot of times I thought I had to show up with all the right answers, and this is in life and in business, but really the power comes from asking the right questions. And a lot of times that means you're going to be talking about the substantive things. It's going to mean that you're really impacting somebody on a deeper level. It means you're going to truly understand the situation you're in, but taking the time to ask really, really good questions. And I got that advice through just shared and watching my wife do that very thing. I would come out of the bathroom. Maybe I would be hanging out with a friend I'd known for 20 years, and I would have excused myself for 2 seconds. I'd come back, and they would be sharing a story with her that I'd never heard anybody share before, that I knew something I never knew about that friend I had for 20 years, just because she just asked the right questions. So in that, I just try to be like my wife whenever I can.
I think that's good advice for all of us, right? But
Yeah.
I do like to ask the questions, because to that point, I think as I look back in my career, and some of the most savvy, intelligent people I've been around, they are the ones that speak the least. They ask the most questions. They're very curious, right? And
Curious, yeah.
I've had some clients that are very curious too, that ask questions. And it's when you have someone's essentially speaking or communicating at that level, again, it allows you or I to be more vulnerable to share things. As you mentioned,
Mhm.
your friends shared something they'd never shared. Well, they probably identified that your wife's like listening and cares, and it's not, hey, I want to know because I want to know, but I want to know because I care. And
Yeah.
there's a difference there, right, in that human interaction.
Yep. It's so true. It's so true. And I think we can all take a little more time to dive into the humanness of those interactions and to get into those internal sort of issues and yep, talk feelings. That's right. We're talking about it. Talk feelings out there. That's in leadership. That's with our clients and those interactions with our vendors, and kind of moving through the space in a more coach like way. All the best coaches ask all the best questions. And I think if we approach things in that sort of space and try to continue to look at the world around us and the people in it as they're all heroes, and we can help them win their day and win their hero journey, what an amazing world that would be if everybody sort of took that role as much as possible with those around them.
So what's upcoming and exciting for you, Paul?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm really excited for a couple group trainings that we have put together for some clients that are really using the power of story for the purpose of sales. A lot of times people feel really icky, like they need to take a shower after they get done with a sales conversation. And I think that is something that we can alleviate people with. So we're doing some group trainings and some skill workshops around using stories for selling without feeling salesy. So I'm excited to do that. I always love group work. The dynamic around that is always really fun because you just have so much cross pollination of ideas and so much energy around that and shared experience there. So we're really excited for that. And really just kind of getting through the end of the year, hitting some of those goals that we'd set last year with clients, and they're looking forward into Q1 of the next year. It's always an exciting time for coaching and for really bringing new projects into the world, be it new podcast brands or new businesses altogether. Really looking forward to that push at the beginning of the year where people are embarking on the new things.
What do you do for fun?
Ooh, I still go kayaking, and I do that for myself for fun, but have a 6-year-old and almost 9-year-old that we go out paddling and hanging out on the river. We live right on a beautiful river in Washington State, and so being able to get those guys out in their backyard and exploring the rapids and sharing some of those life lessons via the river with them is one of my favorite things to do. And then I try to keep up with them on the bike trails as well. So getting outside, playing, and just sharing adventures together.
Oh, that's incredible. And Paul, again, I can't thank you enough for coming on. And for those listening, I mean, Paul, touched on, just a few things here about, the brand script and messaging, but I can tell you, just having worked with you twice now on the website and the podcast, he knows his stuff. Paul does a phenomenal job, extremely competitive and in many ways, right? And I think the value's there, and I think you showcased that in the episode. So I can't thank you enough for helping me with my rebrand, helping us, launch the Brad Leavitt Podcast, and of course, making time to join us today.
Hey, you're very welcome. If you need anything at all or have any questions, jump over to tributarycoaching.com. There's a marketing assessment there, and you can jump on a free consultation. We can take a look at messaging, website, whatever it is that you're looking to do. Happy to help.
And so outside of tributarycoaching.com, where else can they find you?
On pretty much any social media platform that seems relevant today, be that LinkedIn or Instagram or Facebook or what was Twitter. Any of those are great spots. YouTube as well. Tributarycoaching.com will get you there.
Amazing, Paul. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity and the chance to share with your audience. Congrats on the new podcast.
If you get value from the show, please support us by giving a 5-star rating and review on whatever platform you listen to. And I also have a favor to ask. We've had some incredible guests that come on and share their wisdom, their knowledge about their business. So if you have friends or family members that could benefit from those episodes, please share it with them, as well as any other business owners that you're networking with that could get value from the podcast or certain episodes. Please share those as well. Again, subscribe, make sure you're following. Any questions that you have, topics. We've had listeners reach out about certain guests that we should have on the show. Again, brad.l@aftconstruction.com. email me for topics to address, guests that we should have on, and even if you think you'd be a great guest for the show. So again, thank you for all your support, and we'll see you next time.